At 9:45 on a Tuesday morning in November, with frost still needling the parade ground grass and a crowd of 200 people standing in tight military rows, Colonel Denise Arnett reached out and took the medals off a man who had not given her permission to touch him. She didn't ask first. She did not hesitate. Her gloved hand closed around the cluster of ribbons and decorations pinned to the lapel of his civilian jacket, a dark wool jacket, pressed and clean, the kind a man wears when he wants to be presentable. And she pulled. The ribbon tore at the backing. 3 medals swung loose. 1 hit the pavement. The man did not step back. He did not raise his hands. He stood exactly as he had been standing, feet shoulder-width apart, hands at his sides, eyes forward on the reviewing stand. His jaw was set. The only sign that anything had reached him was the slow, deliberate way he bent down, without asking permission, without breaking eye contact with some fixed point above her head, and picked the medal up from the ground. "Civilians do not wear military decorations on this installation," Colonel Arnett said. Her voice carried. She had positioned herself so it would. He straightened. He held the medal in his closed fist. "Sir," she said, and the word was not an honorific. It was a correction, clipped and precise as a door being shut. "I need you to step out of this formation." The man at his left was a retired Gulf War sergeant named Hollis, who had been standing perfectly still since the moment Arnett approached. He stared forward the way people stare forward when they are deciding something and have not decided yet. The crowd was very still. Now, before we go any further, you need to understand what she did not know. You need to understand what she could not have guessed, or refused to look for, or simply never thought to ask. Because this story is not about cruelty exactly. It is about the specific blindness that comes from deciding you already know what you're looking at. Let me take you back. Marvel Okafor was born in Kinston, North Carolina, in the summer of 1961, the third son of a woman who worked the tobacco line 6 days a week and a man he did not remember clearly. The woman who raised him, truly raised him, was his grandmother, Adeline. She had a voice like a slow organ chord and hands that had done every kind of work the county offered. And she believed with a completeness that left no room for doubt that a person's mind was the one property the world could not seize. She said it differently. She said, "What you carry up here," she would tap the side of her head with 2 fingers, "nobody can repossess that. Not the landlord, not the boss, not the state of North Carolina." Marvel was 13 when she said that, and he was sitting at her kitchen table with a library book open in front of him. A library book about military history, because that was what he was reading that particular month, the way he read everything, with the voracious specificity of a child who understood instinctively that books were a kind of trespass the world could not prosecute. She put a cup of sweet tea down beside the book without asking if he wanted it, because she already knew. He read because Adeline had taught him that a library card was a complete education for anyone willing to carry it seriously. There was one branch in Kinston, and he used it until the librarian, a woman named Mrs. Cabarrus who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and smelled of cedar and library paste, knew his patterns well enough to start pulling books from the return cart that she thought might interest him before they made it back to the shelves. She did this without making a production of it. She simply placed the stack on the counter when he came through the door on Saturdays, and he took them without comment, because some forms of respect are communicated most precisely through silence. History first, then geography, then the technical manuals for machinery he would never own but wanted to understand. He read about diesel engines and irrigation systems and the construction methods for suspension bridges, not because he intended to build bridges, but because understanding how systems held their weight under stress seemed like information a person should have. At 17, he decided he wanted to understand what people said in the countries he was reading about, which seemed to him the most natural extension of the study. He taught himself Spanish from a textbook he renewed 9 times. Then he started Portuguese. He reached the middle of a French grammar before he graduated high school, not fluent, not accomplished, but able to track the shape of a conversation and catch its weight, which he understood early was often enough. The full text was a luxury. The structure was the thing. He enlisted at 21. His grandmother drove him to the recruiter's office in her 1974 Buick and waited in the parking lot while he signed the papers, sitting with her hands folded on the steering wheel and her eyes closed. He thought at first she was praying. Then he realized she was just holding something. On the day he shipped to Fort Bragg for basic training, she pressed something into his hand at the bus station. A small bronze star on a pin, the kind sold at military supply stores for a few dollars, not the decoration itself. "Just the shape of it," she said, "so you remember what you are made of before they tell you." He pinned it in the inner pocket of his uniform jacket and carried it through basic and through Germany, and through a cold assignment in Korea, and through 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. It was with him in every country he had ever stood in uniform, in every formation, in every decision made under circumstances that required knowing the ground before he could know what to do. He was a natural in the army, the way certain people are natural in an institution, not because they conform to it easily, but because they understand it deeply, including the parts that don't work. He rose through the NCO ranks with the slow accumulation of someone who treated every assignment as a question the job was asking him to answer correctly. His particular gifts were spatial memory and what his early commanding officers described in evaluations as uncommon situational awareness, which was a formal way of saying he paid attention to things that most people did not register as information. He read the human geography of every posting the same way he had read the technical manuals in Mrs. Cabarrus's library, not for immediate application but for the structural understanding, because the structure was what mattered when the situation changed. In Germany, he learned what the physical posture of tired soldiers at a checkpoint communicated versus the physical posture of bored ones, which were 2 different risk profiles. In Korea, he learned the specific way that institutional silence spread through a unit when something had gone wrong at a command level 3 above where he was standing. These were not things taught in any training module. They were the knowledge of someone who had learned to pay attention as a way of surviving in a world that was not arranged for his convenience, and who had brought that skill with him into uniform the same way he had carried the bronze star in his chest pocket. His soldiers called him Map, a nickname that began as a reference to his skill at terrain and became something larger, something about orientation, about the capacity to locate yourself and everyone around you in a confusing landscape and tell the others where north was. He did not discourage it. It was accurate. In 2005, in the punishing heat of an Iraqi August, Marvel was serving as the operations sergeant for a forward operating base outside Ramadi, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Howard Calloway. The base sat on the western edge of an area where 3 competing groups operated within 2 kilometers of one another, and where the landscape changed its character, not geographically, but politically and tactically, between 7 in the morning and 9. The job, as Marvel understood it, was not simply to move supplies and personnel. It was to read the human ground correctly every single day, to understand what the behavior of vendors and the routing choices of local drivers and the timing of specific activity at specific intersections was actually saying, and to translate that language into decisions that kept people alive. One morning in August, a convoy of 11 men was routed through a canyon road southeast of the city on an updated directive that had not passed through Marvel's desk. He saw the route plan at 6:45 and something in him went quiet in a specific way, the particular internal silence that always preceded his most important observations. He had been through that road 14 times. He knew the hour at which the shadow patterns shifted on the 3rd bend, and what that meant for a gunner positioned above it. He knew what the tyre tracks along the eastern wall indicated about recent vehicle passage. He knew from a conversation 3 days earlier with the owner of a hardware stall outside the base perimeter that the movement patterns in that canyon had shifted in a way that had not yet made it into any intelligence report. He called Calloway at 6:52. He said, "I need 4 minutes, sir." That was all he asked for. 4 minutes to lay out what he knew and how he knew it, which was not from any document but from the habit of attention he had been building since he was 13 at a kitchen table in Kinston. Calloway gave him the 4 minutes. He got them back on a different route. He did not think of it as saving 11 lives. He thought of it as doing the job that knowing the ground made possible. But the Army categorized it as a decisive operational action taken under direct fire conditions, which earned him the Silver Star, which they pinned on his chest at a ceremony in the dining facility, with Calloway standing 2 rows back, watching with an expression Marvel did not have the angle to read clearly. He was looking at the medal and thinking about Adeline's pin in his chest pocket and the specific distance between the 2 objects, which was no distance at all. He spent his last 5 years of service in 2 further postings and retired in the fall of 2010 as a Master Sergeant. 28 years of service, 7 decorations, 2 letters of commendation, and the specific kind of knowledge that cannot be replicated by any credential system because it was built entirely outside of one. In a library in Kinston, and in the geography of every country he had ever worked, and in the 400 small decisions that accumulate over decades into the thing people call judgment, not knowing its origin. He was 49. He attended the retirement ceremony in his dress uniform with his decorations in their correct order, and accepted the handshakes from officers he respected and officers he did not, and he drove back to his apartment in the late afternoon light, and sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on a lamp. Not grief, exactly. Not loss. Something more like the particular quiet of a man who has been moving toward a fixed point for a very long time and has arrived at it and is now required to choose the next direction without a map anyone else has drawn. He didn't know exactly what to do next. His grandmother died in the spring of 2011 at 87 in the same house where he had grown up, with her library card on the bedside table. She left him the Buick, which he kept running for 4 more years out of a feeling he could not fully name, and she left him a 3-page letter, handwritten, the script increasingly careful as it went on in the way that hands are careful when they are being precise about something important. He read it once at the kitchen table with a cup of sweet tea he had made because the situation required it, and then he folded it and has not read it again since. He knows every word of it anyway. It ends the same way she always ended things. He took the groundskeeper job on the base in the fall of 2011. He needed proximity to ground that felt like his. He needed the meditative quality of work that required close attention to small systems. He needed, though he would not have named it this way, to be somewhere that spoke his language. The base spoke his language. He had been learning it for 3 decades. He knew the installation intimately within a month, in the specific way of someone who had learned every posting by walking it until it lived inside him. He knew the drainage culvert that flooded in March and the groundwater table under the parade ground and the frost heave pattern in the flagstone path by the officers' club. He knew the root depth of each oak along the perimeter road, and which 3 were losing the argument with the clay soil and would need to be replaced before the next winter. He knew the name of the private who had planted them in 1968 because he had talked at length to that man's daughter, who brought her father's lunch on Fridays and always stopped to look at the trees before she went in. He knew the base the way a physician knows a patient who has been in their care for a long time, not from a chart but from accumulated presence. He knew which drainage solution would hold through March and which would need a second pass in April. He knew the 3 places on the perimeter road where the asphalt cracked first in a hard freeze, and the 2 places where standing water in summer drew the specific species of mosquito that was a vector problem rather than a nuisance problem. He knew the building superintendent's schedule and the maintenance officer's priorities and the particular communication style of every facilities coordinator who had cycled through in 19 years, and he adjusted his reporting accordingly. Because knowing the ground also meant knowing who needed what kind of information delivered in what kind of way. He wore his medals on Veterans Day every year, 19 years of the same day, the same grounds, the same wool jacket, the decorations in their correct order on the left lapel, and Adeline's bronze star on the right, the one that was not a military decoration and had never pretended to be. He wore them because he was a retired service member with the right to do so under the same regulations that Colonel Arnett would cite, and because this ground was his ground and the formation was his formation, and there was no version of Veterans Day on which he would not be present in the fullest sense of the word. Here is what you need to understand about Veterans Day on this particular installation, in this particular year. The formation was not only a ceremony. A new building on the east side of the base, a command training centre built over 3 years and finished that October, was to be dedicated and named at the end of the programme. The naming had been kept quiet at the personal preference of the base commander. Protocol reasons, the Public Affairs Office said when asked. The General prefers to let the moment speak. The base commander was Brigadier General Howard Calloway. Marvel had known this for 2 years since the assignment was posted in the base newsletter. He had felt something when he read the name, and he had filed it, and not examined it closely because it required a stillness he had not yet arranged, and because the grass along the east quad had needed attention that week. and because he was not a man who forced a question before the question was ready. People who had saved each other's lives under fire sometimes lost track of each other in the institutional machinery of careers and transfers and retirements and further careers. That was simply how things worked. He didn't hold any version of Calloway responsible for it. He arrived at 6:30 that morning in his work clothes with a flashlight to walk the flagstone one final time, because the frost had been irregular and the reviewing stand apron needed to hold 200 people without incident. He found the loose stone he had suspected was there at the left edge of the first step and reported it to facilities at 6:58. Then he went home. He dressed slowly, the way he dressed for all things that mattered. He pressed the wool jacket the night before. He laid his decorations out on the dresser in the order he would pin them, running his thumb across each one briefly in the way he had always done before a formation, the same gesture for 28 years in uniform and 19 years in the wool jacket. He pinned the 7 decorations on the left lapel, the silver star at the top, and the small bronze star on the right lapel. Separate and always separate, just a shape. Just hers. He returned at 9:15 and took his place in the veterans section. Hollis nodded at his medals. That nod was its own decoration. Colonel Arnett walked the formation at 9:32 with the systematic efficiency of a protocol officer conducting a compliance sweep, her eyes moving row by row, and she arrived at the second row and stopped. She looked at the wool jacket and the civilian shoes and the groundskeeper's hands, square and calloused and permanently stained at the cuticles with the residue of outdoor work. She looked at all of this, and she built her conclusion from the visible evidence, because the conclusion did not require invisible evidence. The invisible kind required questions. She reached out and she took the medals. What she said after she took them made it worse. She said it again, louder the second time, loud enough for the row in front and the row behind to hear, that civilians did not wear military decorations on this installation. She used the word civilians as though it were a category she had already correctly assigned. A closed verdict rather than a preliminary description. She held the 3 medals in her gloved hand and looked at Marvel as though waiting for the natural response, which in her model of this situation was mortification and quick retreat. Marvel had the loose medal from the ground and he held it in his fist and he looked at a point above her head and he did not speak. A second iteration of silence is different from the first. The first could be shock. The second is a position. Arnett made a small gesture to her left, and Corporal Yolanda Pierce materialized from the near edge of the crowd, 24 years old, 3 years in, hands at her sides and jaw set in the expression of a soldier who has been placed in a situation that her training has not fully equipped her for, and who is deciding in real time what her training actually means. She had watched the entire sequence from 12 feet away. She stood beside Arnett and did not touch anyone. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Arnett said. Her voice had dropped to the register of a correction being delivered for the last time before it became something else. "Step out of the formation," Marvel said. "No, ma'am." 2 words. Unhurried. As level as an instrument reading, as settled as a man who has been more frightened, in more consequential places, by more credible threats, and has stood still through all of them. Arnett's posture changed. A slight forward compression, the body's preparation for an escalation. Imani Cruz moved. Imani was 17 feet away in the commissary staff section in her base uniform with 11 years of working alongside Marvel and a complete working knowledge of who he was and what was on his lapel and what it meant. She knew his grandmother's name and the story of the Buick and the details of the library in Kinston. She knew the way he paused before answering a complex question, taking the full space of the pause without apology. She knew that the medals on his left lapel had been worn in this formation every November for as long as she had worked on this installation, and she knew with complete certainty that the man standing very still with his jaw set and a medal in his closed fist was the specific opposite of what Colonel Arnett had concluded. She had watched the entire sequence from the moment Arnett walked over, her hands folded in front of her, computing the arithmetic of intervention. The answer was not complex. It was the simplest arithmetic, what she knew and who needed to know it, and how quickly that information could travel. She walked to the edge of the crowd at a pace that would not draw attention, a woman with somewhere to be rather than a woman in a hurry, and she took out her phone. She had the aide's number because she ran commissary logistics and he managed the general's event calendar, and they exchanged texts about quantities and timing 3 or 4 times each month. She opened a new message and typed 5 words. Marvel Okafor is being stopped. She put the phone in her pocket and walked back to her place. 40 seconds. The aide read the text. He looked up from his clipboard and looked at the formation. He leaned to his left and spoke 4 words quietly to the man standing beside him on the reviewing stand. Brigadier General Howard Calloway turned from his position at the centre of the stand and looked at his parade ground. He saw the wool jacket and the groundskeeper's hands and the medals in a closed fist rather than on a lapel, and he saw the protocol officer's gloved hands, and something in his face went to the quality of stillness that happens to people who have learned to make decisions in compressed time and are currently making one. He came down from the stand. 3 steps at the side, unhurried, and then he walked across the parade ground at the pace of a general officer, which is a pace that requires no urgency because the presence itself is sufficient. The formation parted for him by instinct, the particular unconscious physics of institutional authority moving through a crowd, people stepping back before they fully understood why. The clearing of space followed him like a wake across the frost-hardened grass. He stopped 6 feet from where Marvel stood. He did not look at Colonel Arnett. He looked at Marvel Okafor. He looked at the groundskeeper's jacket and the medals in the closed fist and the small bronze star on the right lapel, the one that was not a military decoration, the one whose story he didn't know yet, but whose presence told him something specific about the man wearing it. He stood at attention. His heels came together, his hands went to his sides, and Brigadier General Howard Calloway raised his right hand in a salute. The sound that moved through the 200 people on that parade ground was not applause and not a gasp. It was the specific, involuntary exhalation of a crowd that has been watching a tension build toward the wrong resolution for 15 minutes and has just felt the balance tip. It was the sound of a moral debt being acknowledged publicly. It moved from the front row to the back and back again, a ripple that did not dissipate. Marvel's right hand came up. Clean. Steady, the way it had come up 10,000 times before. 28 years of muscle memory standing in his body where his youth used to be. He held the salute. Calloway held his. 3 seconds, which is an enormous amount of time on a parade ground in front of 200 people when everyone understands what the 3 seconds mean. Both hands came down together. Calloway turned to Colonel Arnett. His voice was level in the register of a general speaking to a colonel about a procedural matter that would have administrative consequences, and its levelness was the most precisely calibrated instrument in the situation. He said, "Colonel, return the sergeant's decorations." She placed the 3 medals in Marvel's open palm. Calloway turned back to Marvel. He spoke in a voice calibrated for the nearest 12 people but audible to the 20 beyond them. "Master Sergeant Okafor, it is my honour to have you present at this morning's ceremony. I hope you'll stay through the dedication, the rank, the name, in that order. Returned to their owner in front of witnesses by the person with the institutional authority to make the return count." Marvel said, "Yes, sir," and pinned his medals back on his lapel, each one in its correct position, with the same unhurried hands that had fixed the flagstone at 6:58 that morning. Imani Cruz, 17 feet away, pressed her hands together briefly in front of her commissary uniform. A private gesture, one that lasted only a moment and contained everything. Corporal Pierce stood 3 feet from where Arnett had been standing and filed what she had witnessed in the place where she kept the things she intended to understand properly later. She had 3 years in and a long service ahead of her, and she had just watched a general salute a groundskeeper, and the image was going to do something to her understanding of what credentials actually are and where they actually live that no training module would be able to replicate. The ceremony resumed at 11:10. The speeches ran 40 minutes. Marvel stood in the second row and listened. Colonel Arnett stood on the platform with the stillness of a person computing a reckoning they had not prepared for. At 12:15, Calloway returned to the microphone. He spoke for 7 minutes without notes. He said the building was a command training centre built to prepare non-commissioned officers for the complexity of operational environments, for the kind of terrain reading and human geography work that kept soldiers alive when plans changed and maps became insufficient. He said every building needed a name that meant something. He said the best names come from the ground up, from the people who had actually done the work the ground required. He said the building would be called the Okafor Training Centre. He did not explain it. He did not turn to find Marvel in the formation. He said the name and let it stand, the way names stand when they belong to the ground they are spoken on. And the 200 people who had watched what happened at 9:45 needed no explanation. The applause started in the veterans section, second row, and moved outward in every direction. Marvel stood in it with his right hand at his lapel, 2 fingers touching the small bronze star that was just a shape, and never just a shape. And he stood that way while the applause moved over him and past him and upward into the cold November air. The formal consequence for Colonel Arnett was administrative in its form, which was appropriate, a letter of reprimand in her service record. Transfer orders issued 6 weeks later to a logistics coordination posting in another state, effective January, announced in language that named no cause. She left on a Thursday morning in a grey sedan with her personal effects in 2 boxes and no ceremony. The protocol office was reorganised the following month under a captain named Simmons, who had a specific practice of asking questions before conclusions, and who became known within a season as the kind of officer you could bring complicated situations to. That was the institutional consequence. Quiet, structural, precisely proportional to the original cruelty, which had been to look at a man and decide what he was without asking. The consequence was removal from every position in which asking well was the job. Marvel stayed for the reception at noon. He stood in a room of officers and officials and family members in his wool jacket, with his medals on his lapel, and talked to 2 retired sergeants he had not seen in 11 years, and ate a piece of pound cake and answered 6 or 7 questions about the building's name with complete honesty, which was that he had not known it was coming. He watched the room do what rooms do after a ceremony, expand and relax, and sort itself into the conversations that the formality had been holding back. He watched Corporal Pierce across the room, standing near the window looking at her phone, and then putting it away and looking out the window instead. And he recognized the expression, which was the expression of someone who had witnessed something they intended to carry carefully. He and Calloway stood by the north window for 17 minutes. They talked about the drainage under the East Quad, which had needed intervention for 2 administrations and would cost a specific amount to fix correctly and would cost considerably more if left through another winter. They talked about the 3 failing oaks on the perimeter road and the replacement plan Marvel had already drawn up in his head, with the specific species that would do better in that soil and the optimal timing for the transplants. They talked about the specific practical things the training centre could be used for beyond its formal curriculum, if the NCO advisory board was set up correctly, the kinds of conversations that happened best between sergeants in informal settings without a grade attached, the kinds that produced the actual operational knowledge that formal curricula could only approximate. They talked the way 2 men who have shared difficult ground talk about the things that need to be done, seriously without drama, with the implicit understanding that the conversation was also about something larger that neither of them needed to name. Before they separated, Calloway mentioned that the Okafor Training Centre would need a civilian liaison to the NCO Advisory Board, an office on the east side, a coordinator's salary, a role that required the kind of institutional knowledge that could not be sourced from a job posting. He said he planned to open the position formally in January. He said he thought Marvel should apply, and the way he said it communicated clearly in the Register of Generals who have arrived at a conclusion while leaving the procedural forms intact that the application was the last formal step in an arrangement already made. Marvel said he would think about it seriously. He meant it. He was not a man who rushed a question, and this one required the right kind of stillness. Imani called that evening while he was at the kitchen table with a cup of sweet tea and Adeline's letter folded beside it. She did not ask how he was feeling. She said the commissary supply chain mapping was going to collapse without his knowledge of the new storage routes, and when he laughed she told him she was being perfectly serious, and that the naming of a building did not change the status of the loading dock situation, which remained his problem as far as she was concerned. He told her she was right. She said she knew. The building opened in February on a grey Wednesday morning, and he walked the east corridor alone before anyone else arrived, in the early light that fell flat and honest through the windows. He had his keys on the ring that also held his groundskeeper fob, which he had not yet returned to facilities because the paperwork for his new position was still being processed, and the East Quad still needed someone to watch the frost heave through March. The corridor smelled of fresh paint, a new carpet, and the particular institutional neutrality of a building that had not yet taken on the character of the people who would work in it. That would come. It always came. He stopped at the small brass nameplate mounted at eye level on the wall beside the entrance. His name, his rank, the span of his service years, 1982 to 2010, which was a long time to be building something no one could see until the moment it was needed. He put 2 fingers to it, the way Adeline had put 2 fingers to the side of her head at the kitchen table when he was 13, and he stood there in the light for a long, quiet moment. Behind him, through the window at the end of the corridor, the oak trees along the perimeter road were bare and grey, the 3 failing ones among them still standing, not yet replaced. He would see to those in April. The building held the full shape of what she had always said. What you carry up here, nobody can repossess. Not the landlord, not the boss, not the colonel in her gloves on a November morning reaching for something she had already decided was hers to take. The world has always reached for it. The specific blindness that reaches for it is old and persistent, and has worn many different uniforms across many different centuries. But reaching is not taking. Not ever. The world has not yet developed the instrument for it. If you have stood in a formation or a meeting or a room and felt someone look at you and make a decision before they asked the question, you already know what Marvel Okafor was holding on that parade ground. Not just the medals. Something older than the medals. Something assembled at a library counter in Kinston, and on the terrain of 4 countries and in the 4 compressed minutes outside Ramadi, when everything depended on whether he knew the ground. Something that no ceremony confers and no stripped lapel can remove, because it was never located on the lapel. It was located, and has always been located, exactly where Adeline said. What she knew, what she pressed into a 21-year-old hand, in the shape of a small bronze star in a bus station in 1982, is that the work of building something real in yourself is its own protection. Not because the world will not try. It will always try. But what you build properly in the library and on the ground and in total silence across years of obsession and discipline is not located anywhere a hand can reach. The room will eventually stop blocking the door. Whatever you have been building in silence, keep building it. The door will open or it will be named after you. Either way, it was already yours. If this story belongs to someone you know, press it into their hand the way Adeline did, before they board the bus. Before they need to remember what they are made of. The shape of it matters. Pass it forward.